I shouldn't have heard that conversation, but the moment I did, my life stopped belonging to me. The glass nearly slipped from my fingers as the words cut through the low hum of the restaurant. Shipment, Thursday, Warehouse 17. Each one landing heavier than the last. And I kept my head down like I hadn't noticed, like I was just another waitress balancing a tray and chasing tips under warm golden lights. But my hands betrayed me. They trembled, subtle but enough to make the crystal glasses chime softly against each other. And that sound felt louder than it should have, like it echoed across the entire room, even though no one else seemed to react. Or maybe they did, and I just couldn't breathe enough to notice, because something had already shifted, something invisible but sharp, like stepping onto thin ice and hearing the first crack beneath your feet. I told myself to walk, just walk, don't look back, don't think, don't exist beyond this moment. But then I felt it, a gaze, steady, controlled, deliberate, the kind that didn't wander, didn't hesitate, the kind that chose its target and stayed there. And I knew without turning who it had to be, because everyone in that room moved around him without ever touching him, like gravity itself bent to his presence. I turned anyway, just enough, and our eyes met, dark, unreadable, calm in a way that made my pulse spike instead of settle. He wasn't watching the men discussing whatever I wasn't supposed to hear. He was watching me, like I was the only variable that had changed in an otherwise perfect equation. I looked away. Too fast, my breath catching. And that's when it happened. My foot caught the edge of the carpet. The tray tilted, and for 1 second, everything slowed. The liquid inside the glasses shifting, the light catching every ripple, my heart slamming so hard I felt it in my throat. And then a hand, firm, steady, catching my wrist before the tray could fall, grounding me back into the moment with a grip that was strong but controlled, never rough, never careless, just absolute. I froze my skin, reacting instantly to the contact, and before I could pull away, his gaze dropped, not to the tray, not to the mess that almost happened, but to my wrist, to the place I had carefully covered all night, the sleeve that had slipped just an inch too far, revealing what I had spent 20 minutes hiding in the bathroom mirror under cheap foundation and dim lighting. I felt it before I saw it, the shift in him, subtle but undeniable, like a temperature drop in the air around us. His thumb barely moved, just enough to hold my wrist steady, and his voice when he spoke was low, controlled, but it carried. Who did that to you? And it wasn't curiosity, it wasn't even anger, it was something colder, something precise, like he was asking a question he already intended to act on. I swallowed, my mind scrambling, defaulting to survival, to habit, to denial. It's nothing, I said quickly, too quickly, pulling my sleeve down, trying to reclaim what little control I had left, but he didn't let go immediately, his eyes lifting back to mine, searching, not for the truth, but for the lie, measuring it, weighing it, deciding what it was worth, and for a second, just one, I felt seen in a way that made my chest tighten, not exposed, not judged, just understood, and that scared me more than anything else that had happened tonight, because understanding meant involvement, and involvement meant danger, and danger was already circling me from 2 directions. The conversation I wasn't supposed to hear and the life I wasn't supposed to escape. And then I heard it, behind him. Quieter than before, but sharp enough to cut through everything. She heard too much, a voice said. Calm, dismissive, like they were talking about a problem, not a person, and my stomach dropped, because I knew that tone. I knew what came after it. Not loud, not messy, just final. I instinctively tried to pull my hand free, my breath coming faster now. But his grip tightened just slightly, not enough to hurt, just enough to stop me, to anchor me in place as he turned his head, not fully, just enough to acknowledge the voice behind him, and when he spoke again, it wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. Then she's under my protection now, he said, like a decision had just been made that no one else in the room had the authority to question, and something in the air shifted again, heavier this time, final, and when his eyes returned to mine, there was no hesitation left in them, only certainty, the kind that didn't ask for permission, the kind that changed everything without warning. And in that moment, I realized 2 things at once. I wasn't safe anymore, but somehow, I wasn't alone either. The room did not explode into chaos the way I expected it to. No one shouted. No one reacted. The music kept playing softly somewhere above us and glasses still clinked in polite conversation, but everything felt different, like the air had thickened, like every breath had to push through something unseen. His hand was still around my wrist, steady, grounding, and I realized I had stopped shaking, not because I felt safe, but because something else had taken over, something quieter, sharper. The instinct that told you when your life had just shifted onto a different path, and there was no stepping back. I swallowed hard and forced my voice to work. "You should not do that," I whispered, barely able to meet his eyes. "I am just a waitress." The words sounded small even to me, like they belonged to a version of myself that had existed 5 minutes ago, before I heard too much. Before he decided something about me that I did not understand. His gaze did not soften, but it changed, just slightly, like he was adjusting something in his mind, recalculating. "That is exactly why I am doing it," he said quietly, and the certainty in his voice made my chest tighten, because it did not sound like a choice. It sounded like a rule he had already decided to follow. Behind him, I could feel the attention shifting, not openly, not in a way anyone else in the restaurant would notice. But the men at the table had gone still in that subtle way powerful people do when something unexpected enters their space. I felt it in the silence between their words, in the way their conversation no longer flowed naturally. And I knew without looking that I had become the center of something I did not understand. "Sir," one of them said, polite but edged with something firmer underneath. "This is unnecessary." I did not see his reaction immediately because I was too focused on breathing, on staying upright, on not letting the panic claw its way up my throat. But I felt the shift again, the slight tightening of his grip before he finally let go of my wrist, slowly, deliberately, like releasing something he had already claimed. "Nothing I do is unnecessary," he replied, calm, controlled, and the words settled over the table like a line no one wanted to cross. I stepped back instinctively, pulling my sleeve down again, my skin still tingling where he had touched me, and for a second I thought that was it, that I could walk away, disappear into the background again, pretend none of this had happened. But then he moved, just one step closer, enough to close the distance I had tried to create, and my breath caught again. "You are not leaving alone tonight," he said, not a question, not even a suggestion, just a statement, and my heart stuttered, because that was the part one had not prepared for, not the danger, not the attention, but the certainty. "I have to finish my shift," I said quickly, grasping for something normal, something that still made sense. "They will fire me if I just walk out." It sounded ridiculous even as I said it, like I was trying to hold on to rules that no longer applied. But it was all I had. He watched me for a long second, and then something unexpected happened, something small but disorienting. The corner of his mouth shifted, not quite a smile, more like an acknowledgement. "You will not lose your job," he said, and before I could respond, before I could even process what that meant, he turned slightly, just enough to catch the attention of someone behind me. "Manager," he called, his voice carrying just enough to reach the right ears without disturbing the rest of the room. My manager appeared almost instantly, like he had been waiting for that exact moment, his posture straighter than I had ever seen it, his usual impatience replaced by something closer to caution. "Yes, sir," he said, and I had never heard him sound like that before, not once in the 2 years I had worked here. "She is done for the night," the man beside me said simply, and my manager nodded immediately, no hesitation, no questions, like the decision had already been made somewhere far above him. "Of course," he replied, glancing at me briefly, confusion flickering in his eyes before disappearing just as quickly. "Emily, you can clock out." I blinked, my mind struggling to keep up, because this was not how anything worked. This was not how normal life worked. People did not just decide things and have the world rearrange itself around them. But apparently he did, and the realization settled deep in my chest, heavier than fear, heavier than anything else I had felt tonight, because it meant I was no longer in control of even the smallest parts of my life. I looked back at him, really looked this time, at the way he stood there like everything around him belonged to him, like outcomes were not uncertain, they were chosen, and for the first time, I understood that when he said I was under his protection, it was not just about the men I had overheard or the life I had tried to hide. It was something bigger, something that reached further than I could see yet. "Get your things," he said, his voice lower now. meant only for me. I will be waiting. And as I turned to walk toward the back room, my legs unsteady but moving. Anyway, I realized the most terrifying part was not that I was leaving with him. It was that a small, quiet part of me felt like I had no other choice. And maybe, just maybe, I did not want one. I should have walked out the back door and never looked back, but my hands were already moving on their own, grabbing my worn jacket from the hook, fingers fumbling over the zipper like they had forgotten how something so simple worked. My reflection caught in the small mirror by the lockers, pale, wide-eyed, a stranger staring back at me. And for a second, I did not recognize the girl who had come into work 3 hours ago worrying about tips and rent and whether she could stretch $20 until Friday. That version of me felt distant now, like someone else's memory, because the girl in the mirror had just been claimed by a man who did not ask for permission. I swallowed and forced myself to breathe, slow, steady, the way I had taught myself on nights when everything felt like too much, when voices got louder and walls felt closer, in through the nose, out through the mouth. But it did not work the same this time, because the fear was different. It was not just about what could happen, it was about what already had. I pushed the door open and stepped back into the hallway. The noise of the restaurant muffled behind the walls, and immediately I felt it again. That shift, like stepping from one world into another. 2 men stood near the exit, both in dark suits, both watching me without pretending otherwise, not hostile, not friendly, just present, like they had always been there, and I had simply never noticed. One of them opened the door without a word, and I hesitated, just for a second, because crossing that threshold felt like something more than leaving work. It felt like crossing into something I could not undo. "Miss Carter," the man said, his tone respectful but firm, and hearing my name in a stranger's voice made my chest tighten, because it meant this was not random. This was planned in a way I did not understand. I stepped outside, the night air cool against my skin, the city quieter than it had been earlier, streetlights reflecting off the wet pavement from a rain I had barely noticed. And there he was, standing beside a black car that looked too expensive for this part of the city, hands in his pockets, posture relaxed but somehow still commanding everything around him, like the street itself belonged to him. He looked up as I approached, his gaze locking onto mine immediately, not searching this time, not questioning, just certain. "You took your time," he said, and I almost laughed at the normalcy of the words, like this was just a late-night conversation between 2 people who knew each other, not whatever this actually was. I had to clock out. I replied, my voice steadier than I felt, and something in his expression shifted again, that same almost smile from before, like he appreciated the answer even if it did not change anything. He opened the car door for me without another word, and I froze, staring at the dark interior like it might swallow me whole, every instinct telling me to step back, to run, to disappear into the city where no one knew my name. But another part of me, quieter but stronger, reminded me of the voice I had heard behind him, the words that had sealed something I could not ignore. "She heard too much," and I knew running would not erase that. It would only make me easier to find. "I am not getting in unless you tell me what is happening," I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my tone, because fear had a strange way of turning into something else when it had nowhere left to go. He studied me for a long moment, the silence stretching just enough to make my heart race again. And then he nodded, once, like I had passed some kind of test I did not know I was taking. "You are being moved. Somewhere safe," he said, simple, direct. "Safe from what?" I asked. Even though I already knew the answer, I just needed to hear him say it. Needed something concrete to hold on to. His eyes held mine, steady, unflinching, from people who do not like loose ends. He replied, and the words settled heavy in my chest, confirming everything I had been trying not to think about. I glanced back at the restaurant, at the life I had just walked out of, the normalcy of it already fading, and for the first time I realized there was no going back. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. I looked at him again, really looked, at the control in his posture, the calm in his voice, the way nothing about him seemed uncertain, and I understood something else then, something that made my breath catch in a completely different way. He was not offering me safety, he was deciding it for me. "And after that?" I asked quietly. "What happens after I am safe?" His gaze did not waver, not even for a second. "And when?" He answered, his voice was softer, but no less certain. That depends on whether you trust me. And the weight of those words hit harder than anything else he had said tonight, because trust was not something I gave easily. Not anymore. Not after everything. But as I stood there under the dim streetlight, with the city stretching out behind me and the unknown waiting in front of me, I realized the truth was much simpler and much more dangerous than that. It was not about whether I trusted him. It was about whether I had any other choice. I stood there for one more second than I should have, the cold air brushing against my skin, the city humming quietly. Behind me like it was pretending nothing had changed, but everything had, and I felt it in the way my chest tightened with every breath, in the way my feet refused to move backward, because something in me already understood that turning around would not take me back to who I was before tonight. It would only leave me exposed to something I could not see coming. I exhaled slowly and stepped forward, sliding into the car, the leather seat cool beneath me, the door closing with a soft, final sound that echoed louder in my mind than it should have. Like a chapter ending without my permission, he walked around to the other side without rushing, without hesitation, and when he got in, the space inside the car shifted immediately, smaller, heavier, filled with his presence in a way that made it impossible to ignore him even if I tried. The engine started smoothly, almost silently, and we pulled away from the curb, the restaurant shrinking in the rearview mirror until it disappeared completely, and I realized I did not even know if I would ever see it again. The streets blurred past the window, familiar buildings turning into something distant and unfamiliar, and I kept my hands folded tightly in my lap to stop them from shaking, focusing on the rhythm of the car, the quiet hum of the engine, anything that could anchor me in something real, but my thoughts kept circling back to the same place, the same question that refused to settle. "Where are you taking me?" I asked. Finally, my voice quieter now, less defiant, more searching. He did not look at me right away. His eyes focused on the road ahead, steady, controlled, like everything else about him. "Somewhere you can breathe," he said. And the answer was so simple it almost frustrated me, because it told me everything and nothing at the same time. I turned slightly to face him, studying the sharp line of his jaw, the calm in his expression, trying to understand how someone could sound so certain about something so unclear. "You do not even know me," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them, because that was the part that did not make sense. People did not change the course of someone else's life without a reason, not like this, not without expecting something. In return, he finally glanced at me then, just for a second, but it was enough to feel the weight of his attention fully. "I know enough," he replied, and there was no arrogance in his tone, no need to prove anything. Just a quiet certainty that made it hard to argue with. I frowned slightly, my fingers tightening together. "What does that mean?" I pressed, needing something more solid, something I could hold on to. His gaze returned to the road, but his voice softened, just slightly, like he was choosing his words more carefully this time. "It means I know you stayed quiet when you should have spoken, and you spoke when you should have stayed quiet," he said, and the words hit me harder than I expected, because they were true in a way I had not put into words myself. I looked away, staring out the window as the city lights stretched into long streaks of gold and white, my reflection faint against the glass. "That does not mean you get to decide what happens to me," I said. The resistance still there, quieter now, but not gone. I needed it to stay, needed something that still felt like mine. He did not respond immediately, and for a moment I thought he would not answer at all. But then he spoke, his voice lower, more deliberate. "No," he said. "It means I already did." And the simplicity of it left no room for misunderstanding, no space to twist the meaning into something more comfortable. I felt my breath catch, my chest tightening again, but this time it was not just fear. It was something more complicated, something that made it harder to look away from him completely, because there was no threat in his tone, no pressure, just a statement of fact. And that was somehow more unsettling than anything else. The car slowed as we turned onto a quieter street, lined with tall buildings that looked untouched by the noise of the rest of the city, and I realized we were no longer somewhere I recognized. The sense of distance settling deeper in my chest. Not just physical distance, but something else, something that felt like a line had been crossed. The car came to a stop in front of a building that looked more like a private residence than anything else. Clean lines, dark windows, no signs, no noise, Just stillness. He turned off the engine, and for a moment neither of us moved. The silence stretching between us. Heavy but not uncomfortable. Just full. Like something unspoken was waiting to be acknowledged. I looked at the building, then back at him, my heart picking up again. "And this is supposed to be safe?" I asked quietly. And this time, when he looked at me, there was something different in his eyes. Not softer, not warmer, but more present, like he was fully choosing this moment. "It is safe because I say it is," he answered, and the confidence in his voice should have been overwhelming, should have pushed me further away, but instead it did something else entirely, something I did not expect. It made me pause, really pause, because for the first time since this night began, I felt something shift inside me. Not trust, not yet, but something close enough to it that I could not ignore it. He reached for the door handle, then stopped, his hand resting there as he looked at me one more time. "You can still walk away," he said, and the words surprised me more than anything else he had done tonight, because they sounded like a choice, like an opening, like something I had been telling myself no longer existed, and for a second, just 1 second, I considered it, the idea of turning around, of stepping back into the night and finding my own way out of whatever this had become. But then I remembered the voice, the words, the way the room had shifted around me, and I knew the truth before I could even say it out loud. Walking away did not mean freedom. It meant facing everything alone, and as I looked at him, really looked, I realized something that changed everything again. He was not offering me control, he was offering me a chance to survive, and I was not sure I could do that without him. I did not move right away even after he opened the door, because something inside me needed one more second to decide if I was stepping into safety or something I would not be able to escape later. The night air felt colder now, sharper against my skin as I finally stepped out of the car, my shoes hitting the pavement with a soft sound that somehow felt louder in the quiet street. He closed the door behind me without rushing, and for a moment we just stood there facing the building, its dark windows reflecting faint pieces of the city behind us. No lights, no noise, nothing that made it feel lived in, just stillness, controlled and deliberate, like everything else about him. "No guards," I said quietly, more to myself than to him, because I expected something obvious, something that matched the image I had built in my head. But there was nothing, and that unsettled me more than if there had been men standing at the door. He glanced at me briefly. "You do not see them," he replied, and the way he said it made me stop asking questions I was not ready to hear the answers to. He stepped forward, and the door unlocked before he even touched it, a soft click that echoed in the silence. And when he pushed it open, warm light spilled out, soft and controlled, nothing like the harsh brightness of the restaurant, or the dim uncertainty of the street. I hesitated again at the threshold, not because I thought he would force me, but because I knew once I crossed it, something would shift again. Something quieter but deeper. "Emily," he said, my name steady in his voice, and I realized he had never asked me what I preferred to be called. He had just chosen it like everything else. "You are safe here," he added, and I did not know why. But that sentence landed differently this time, not as a command, not as a claim, but almost like a promise. I stepped inside, the door closing behind me with that same soft finality, and immediately the space wrapped around me in a way that made my shoulders tense before they slowly began to relax without my permission. The air smelled clean, faintly like something warm and expensive I could not name. The floors polished, the walls lined with art that looked like it belonged in places I had only seen in magazines. Everything precise, intentional, nothing out of place, and suddenly I became aware of myself in a way I had been trying to ignore all night. The cheap fabric of my uniform, the faint stain near the hem, the way my hands still carried the memory of trembling. Even if they had finally gone still, I folded them together again, a habit I could not seem to break. "You can sit," he said, gesturing toward a couch that looked too perfect to touch, and I hesitated before lowering myself onto the edge, like I might leave a mark just by being there. He did not sit right away. Instead, he moved to a nearby table, pouring a glass of water without asking, setting it in front of me with a quiet precision that made me pause, because it was such a small thing, but it felt deliberate, like everything else he did. "Drink," he said, and I obeyed without thinking, the cool water grounding me in a way nothing else had managed to do so far, my throat tightening as I swallowed. realizing only then how dry it had been, how long I had gone without noticing anything except the tension in my chest. He watched me, not in a way that felt invasive, but in a way that felt attentive, like he was waiting for something, not from me, but for me, and that realization made my grip tighten slightly on the glass. Why me? I asked finally, the question coming out quieter than I expected, because it was the one thing that had been circling in my mind since the moment he looked at me. He did not answer immediately, and for a second I thought he might avoid it, but then he stepped closer, not too close, just enough to make his presence impossible to ignore. Because you did not run when you should have, he said, his voice calm, measured, and you tried to lie when you knew it would not work. I frowned slightly, my eyes lifting to meet his. That does not make sense, I said, because it did not. Not in any world I understood. He tilted his head just slightly, like he was considering how much to explain. It means you are not predictable, he replied, and there was something in his tone that made that sound more valuable than it should have been, more important. Like unpredictability was not a flaw but something rare, something he had decided to keep. I looked down at the glass in my hands, the reflection of the light trembling slightly on the surface, and for the first time since this night began, I felt something shift again, not fear, not confusion, but something quieter, something that felt like the beginning of understanding, even if I did not fully grasp it yet. And what happens now? I asked softly, because that question mattered more than anything else. He did not hesitate this time, not even for a second. Now you stay, he said, simple, certain, like it was the only logical outcome. I looked up at him again, my breath catching slightly. For how long? I asked, needing to know where the edges of this were, where it stopped, where I could hold on to something that felt defined. His gaze held mine, steady, unyielding, and when he answered, his voice was lower, quieter, but somehow even more absolute than before. Until I know no one is looking for you, he said, and the words should have brought relief, should have made this feel temporary, manageable, but instead they settled into my chest with a different kind of weight, because they carried something unspoken beneath them, something I could not ignore even if I tried, something that made me realize this was not just about protection anymore. It was about control, about decisions being made for me in ways I did not fully understand yet. And as I sat there in a place that felt too perfect to belong to my life, holding a glass I did not remember picking up, looking at a man who had already changed everything without asking, I realized the most dangerous part was not that he had brought me here. It was that a part of me was starting to believe I might not want to leave. The silence after his words did not feel empty. It felt full, like the room itself was holding something between us that neither of us had said out loud yet. And I sat there staring at the glass in my hands, watching the faint ripple in the water settle until it became completely still, and I realized that was the first time anything had felt still since this night began. My thoughts slowing just enough to catch up with everything that had happened. The restaurant, the voices, his hand on my wrist, the way he said my name like it already belonged in his world. And I did not know which part unsettled me more, the danger I had stepped into or the calm that followed it. You are thinking too loudly, he said, and I looked up, startled, because I had not made a sound, but something in my expression must have given me away. I am trying to understand, I replied, my voice quieter now, not defensive anymore, just honest in a way I had not allowed myself to be before. He studied me for a moment, his gaze steady but not pressing, like he was giving me space without stepping away. Understanding takes time, he said, and there was something in the way he said it that made it feel less like a warning and more like a fact I would have to accept. I let out a slow breath, my fingers loosening slightly around the glass. And what do you do while I am trying to understand? I asked, because that part mattered too. Maybe more than anything else, his answer came without hesitation. I make sure nothing reaches you. And the certainty in his voice should have felt overwhelming, but instead it settled into something quieter inside me, something that felt like relief, and I did not like how quickly that feeling appeared, how easily it slipped past the walls I had built for myself. I set the glass down carefully, the soft sound against the table grounding me again. You talk like everything is already decided, I said, lifting my eyes back to his. Like I do not have a say in any of this. He did not deny it, did not soften the truth to make it easier to accept. You have a say, he replied, but your safety does not. And that distinction landed harder than anything else he had said so far, because it made something very clear. This was not about control for the sake of control. It was about something else entirely, something that operated on a level I was not used to, where decisions were not debated, they were made. And for a moment, I did not know whether to feel trapped by that or protected by it. The room felt warmer now. Or maybe it was just me finally noticing it, the tension in my shoulders easing, slightly without me telling it to. And that realization made me shift in my seat, uncomfortable in a different way, because I was not supposed to feel this settled, not here, not with him. You are not afraid, he said suddenly, and I blinked, caught off guard by the statement. I am, I said quickly, almost automatically, because that was the truth, it had to be, but he shook his head slightly, not disagreeing, just refining. Not the way you should be, he said, and something in my chest tightened at that, because he was right in a way I did not want to admit. The fear was still there, but it was different now, less sharp, less overwhelming, replaced by something more complicated, something that made it harder to pull away from him completely. That does not make sense, I murmured, more to myself than to him. And he took a step closer, not enough to invade my space, just enough to shift the balance again. It does, he said quietly. You are afraid of what might happen, but not of me. And the words settled between us, undeniable and precise. And I realized he had just said something I had not been able to put into words myself. I looked at him, really. Looked at the calm in his expression, the control in the way he held himself, the absence of anything unpredictable or chaotic in his presence. And I understood why my fear had changed. It was not gone. It had just redirected. Maybe I should be, I said softly, because that felt like the safer answer, the more logical one. But he did not react the way I expected. There was no offense, no shift in his posture, just that same steady gaze. Maybe, he agreed, and the simplicity of it made my breath catch slightly, because he was not trying to convince me otherwise. He was not trying to earn anything from me. He was simply there, exactly as he was, and that made him harder to read, harder to predict, and somehow easier to trust at the same time. The thought slipped in before I could stop it, and I quickly looked away, my fingers curling slightly against my palm as I tried to push it back, because trust was not something I gave easily, not anymore, not after everything I had learned about how quickly it could be broken. There is a room prepared for you, he said, his voice pulling me back to the present. You should rest. I nodded slowly, the weight of the night finally catching up to me now that everything had gone quiet, my body reminding me that it had been running on tension for hours, maybe longer. I stood carefully, my legs steady but not fully relaxed, and followed his gesture down a hallway I had not noticed before, the soft lighting guiding the way, the silence stretching comfortably around us. And as I stepped into the room he indicated, I paused at the doorway, turning back to look at him one more time, because there was still one question I had not asked, one that lingered beneath everything else. Why are you really doing this? I said, my voice barely above a whisper, and for the first time since I had met him, there was a pause, not hesitation, but something deeper, something that made the moment feel heavier. And when he answered, his voice was quieter than I had ever heard it, but no less certain, because someone should have done it sooner. And the meaning behind those words settled into me slowly, unfolding in a way that made my chest tighten and my breath catch at the same time. Because for the first time, this did not feel like a decision made out of power or control or even necessity. It felt like something else entirely, something I was not ready to name yet. And as I stepped into the room and the door closed softly behind me, I realized the most dangerous part of all of this was not the world he had pulled me into. It was the possibility that I might not want to leave it. Sleep did not come the way it should have. It came in fragments, in shallow breaths and half-formed thoughts that slipped through my mind like shadows I could not hold on to. And every time I closed my eyes, I saw pieces of the night replaying in sharp flashes, the tray trembling in my hands, the sound of those words I was never supposed to hear, his voice steady and certain as he said I was under his protection, and I would wake again, my body tense, my heart already racing like I had been running instead of lying still in a bed that felt too soft to belong to me. I pushed the covers back and sat up, the room dim but not dark, a soft light coming from somewhere I could not see directly. enough to remind me that I was not where I had been before, that nothing about this was temporary in the way I had tried to convince myself. I swung my feet to the floor slowly, grounding myself in the cool surface beneath me, breathing in and out the way I had learned to do when things felt too close, too loud, too much. But even in the quiet, there was a new awareness now, something subtle but constant, like I was being watched without feeling threatened, like the space itself was aware of me being in it. I stood and moved toward the window, pulling the curtain back just slightly, the city still there beyond the glass, distant and familiar all at once. Lights scattered like nothing had changed, but I knew better now. I had stepped out of that world the moment I got into his car, and standing here, looking down at a street I did not recognize, I felt the weight of that choice settle deeper, not heavy, not suffocating, just real. I let the curtain fall back into place and turned, taking in the room properly for the first time, everything arranged with a precision that felt intentional, the bed untouched except for where I had slept, a chair by the corner, a small table with a glass of water that had been replaced at some point while I was asleep. And that detail made me pause, because I had not heard anyone enter, had not felt anything shift, and yet someone had been there, quiet, careful, invisible. The thought should have unsettled me, but instead it did something else. It reminded me that I was not alone in this place, that everything here functioned around something I did not fully understand yet. I stepped out into the hallway, the soft lighting guiding my way again, the silence still present but not empty. And as I moved forward, I saw him before he saw me, standing near a window at the far end, his posture relaxed but controlled, one hand resting loosely in his pocket, the other holding a phone. He was not looking at anymore, like his attention had shifted before I even made a sound. I slowed my steps, something in me hesitant to interrupt whatever moment he was in, but he turned anyway, his gaze finding mine immediately, like he had been expecting me to appear at that exact second. "You did not sleep," he said, and it was not a question. I shook my head slightly, stepping closer. "Not really," I admitted, my voice still soft from the quiet of the room. He nodded once, like he had already anticipated that answer, and for a moment neither of us spoke, the silence stretching between us but not uncomfortable, just present. "This is not normal," I said finally, the words coming out before I could filter them, because I needed to say something that felt grounded, something that acknowledged the reality of what this was. He tilted his head slightly, considering me. "No," he agreed, and the lack of resistance in his answer caught me off guard. I had expected him to justify it, to explain it, but he did not. He simply accepted it as fact, and that made it harder to push against. "Then why does it feel like it is?" I asked, the question quieter, more honest than anything I had said before, because that was the part that unsettled me the most. Not the danger, not the unknown, but the way everything here felt stable, like I had stepped into something that had been waiting for me without me realizing it. He looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable but not distant, and when he spoke, his voice was lower, more measured. "Because chaos is predictable," he said, "and you are used to it." The words landed with a weight I did not expect, because they were true in a way that made my chest tighten. I looked away, my fingers curling slightly at my sides. "And this is not," I said, more to myself than to him. He took a step closer, not enough to crowd me, just enough to shift the space again. "This is controlled," he replied, and there was no pride in his voice, no need to prove anything, just a statement of what was. I nodded slowly, trying to process that, trying to understand what it meant for me to be here, in a place where things did not happen by accident, where nothing slipped through the cracks the way it had in my life before. "You are still thinking about leaving," he said, and I looked up at him quickly, surprised by how easily he read that. "I am thinking about what happens if I stay," I corrected, because that felt more accurate now. The idea of leaving no longer as simple as it had been before. His gaze held mine, steady, unwavering. "Then you will see," he said, and something in the way he said it made my breath catch slightly, not because it sounded like a promise, but because it sounded like something inevitable, like whatever this was had already begun unfolding, and I was just now catching up to it. And as I stood there in the quiet hallway, with the city still moving somewhere far beyond these walls and him standing in front of me, like nothing in his world was uncertain, I realized the truth had shifted again, It was no longer about whether I would leave. It was about whether I was already too far in to ever go back. The silence between us did not break. It shifted, like something unseen had moved just enough to change the air, and I stood there trying to hold on to the last thing he said, controlled, the word echoing in my mind in a way that made my chest tighten and ease at the same time. Because I had spent so long living in spaces where nothing was controlled, where everything could change without warning, where I had learned to read the smallest signs just to stay one step ahead, and now I was standing in a place where nothing slipped, nothing cracked, nothing happened unless he allowed it to, and I did not know what to do with that. "You are too calm," I said suddenly, the words leaving my mouth before I could soften them, because it was the only way I could describe it. The way he stood there like nothing about this situation unsettled him, like I was not a complication but something already accounted for. He did not react immediately, his gaze steady, thoughtful in a way that made it feel like he was weighing the words instead of rejecting them. "I am calm because I prepared for this," he said, and I frowned slightly, confusion tightening in my chest. "You prepared for me?" I asked, and the idea felt impossible, like I had missed something important, something that had been happening before I even knew it. He shook his head. Once, slow, deliberate. "I prepared for variables," he corrected, and there it was again. That way he spoke about things like they were part of a system I could not see, something structured, something precise, and I am one of those variables, I said, my voice quieter now, more aware. He held my gaze, not denying it, not softening it, just confirming it without saying the word, and something in my chest shifted again, because being a variable meant being unpredictable, but it also meant being important in a way I did not understand yet. I looked away, my thoughts catching up to each other in uneven pieces, trying to form something solid out of everything that had happened. "So what happens when your variables do something you did not expect?" I asked, because that felt like the question that mattered, the one that might tell me where the edges of this really were. He stepped closer again, not invading, just enough to make sure I did not drift too far into my own thoughts. "Then I adapt," he said simply, and the certainty in his voice made it clear that unpredictability did not threaten him. It interested him, and that realization sent something unfamiliar through me, something that felt like both caution and curiosity at the same time. I crossed my arms lightly, not defensive, just grounding. "And if I decide to leave?" I pressed, because I needed to hear it again, needed to test the boundaries he had drawn. His expression did not change, not even slightly. "Then you leave," he said, and for a second the answer felt too easy, too open, like a door left unlocked in a place that should have been secure, but there was something underneath it, something unspoken that made the words heavier than they sounded. I tilted my head slightly, studying him. "But you do not think I will?" I said, because that was the part he was not saying out loud. His gaze held mine, steady, unwavering, and for a moment I thought he might deny it, might give me something softer, something easier to hold on to, but he did not. "No," he said quietly, and the honesty of it settled into the space between us, heavier than any lie could have been. I let out a slow breath, my fingers uncurling slightly at my sides, because there was something strangely grounding about that, about knowing exactly where he stood without having to guess, without having to read between the lines. The hallway felt quieter now, or maybe it was just me finally settling into it, the tension shifting into something else, something that felt less like fear and more like awareness. "You are very certain about things," I said, and this time there was the faintest shift in his expression, not quite a smile, but something close enough to change the atmosphere. Just slightly. "I have to be," he replied, and there was no arrogance in it, just necessity, like certainty was not a choice for him. It was a requirement. I nodded slowly, understanding that more than I expected to, because uncertainty had always been the thing that hurt the most, the thing that made everything harder to navigate. "And what happens if you are wrong?" I asked softly, because no one was always right, no matter how controlled their world was. He did not look away, did not hesitate. "Then I fix it," he said, and something about that answer made my breath catch again, not because it sounded easy, but because it sounded inevitable, like mistakes were not failures in his world. They were just adjustments waiting to be made. I looked at him for a long moment, really looked, at the way he stood there so completely sure of himself, of his decisions, of the space around him. And I realized something that shifted everything again. He was not trying to control me, not in the way I had been controlled before. He was trying to control the outcome, and I just happened to be part of it. The thoughts settled into me slowly, changing the way I saw everything that had happened so far. You are not used to someone protecting you without asking for something in return, he said, and the words landed directly in the center of everything I had been trying not to think about. I froze slightly, my breath catching as I looked at him, because he was right in a way that made it hard to respond, hard to deny. I opened my mouth, then closed it again, because I did not have an answer that felt honest enough to say out loud. And for a moment, neither did he, the silence stretching between us again, but this time. It felt different, not uncertain, not tense, just real. And as I stood there in that quiet space, with him watching me like he already understood something I was still trying to figure out, I realized the truth had shifted again. This was no longer about whether I trusted him. It was about whether I was ready to admit that I already did. The realization did not hit me all at once. It settled in slowly, like something sinking beneath the surface where I could not immediately see it, but I could feel it, heavy and undeniable. And I stood there in that quiet hallway trying to hold on to the version of myself that still questioned everything. The version that did not trust easily, that did not stay where she was told to stay. But it was getting harder to find her in this space, harder to hear her over the calm that seemed to wrap around everything here. You should not know that about me, I said finally, my voice quieter than before, because admitting it felt like giving something away, something I had spent years protecting. He did not look surprised, did not shift or react the way people usually did when they realized they had crossed a line. You showed me, he replied, and I frowned slightly, confusion tightening in my chest again. When? I asked, because I could not remember telling him anything. Not really, not anything that mattered. His gaze stayed on mine, steady, certain. When you did not pull away, he said, and the words caught me off guard, because I had not even realized that moment mattered. The way I had stood there when he held my wrist, the way I had not fought, not run, not reacted the way I thought I would. I looked down at my hands, remembering the feeling of his grip, not painful, not forceful, just there, solid and unyielding in a way that made everything else stop moving for a second. That does not mean I trust you, I said quickly, because I needed to say it, needed to hear it out loud to remind myself it was still true. He nodded once, not arguing, not pushing, just acknowledging it. Not yet, he said, and the addition of those two words made something shift again, because it implied time. It implied something still unfolding, something not finished. I let out a slow breath, my thoughts catching on that idea. Not yet. Like this was not a fixed point, but something that could change, something that already was. I looked back up at him, searching his expression for something I could hold on to, something that made this make sense in a way my mind could accept. You keep saying things like you already know what I am going to do, I said, and there was a hint of frustration in my voice now, not sharp, but present, because I needed to understand where that certainty came from. He tilted his head slightly, considering me again, like he was deciding how much to explain. I do not know, he said finally. I observe, and the distinction felt important, even if I did not fully grasp it yet. And what have you observed about me? I asked, my voice steadier now, because if he was going to define something about me, I wanted to hear it. He took a small step closer, closing just enough distance to make his presence more immediate, more real. You survive by adapting, he said, and the words landed with a quiet precision that made my chest tighten. You do not fight when it will cost you more than it gives you, and you do not run unless you know where you are going. I swallowed, my breath catching slightly, because that was not something I had ever said out loud, not something I had even fully admitted to myself, but hearing it from him made it feel undeniable, like he had taken something internal and placed it in front of me where I could not ignore it. And you think that means I will stay? I said, softer now, because the answer felt like it was already there, waiting for me to accept it. He did not hesitate, not even for a second. I think it means you will choose the option that gives you the best chance, he replied, and something about that phrasing made it harder to argue, harder to push back against, because it was not about him, not really. It was about me, about how I had always navigated things, even when I did not realize it. I looked away, my fingers curling slightly again as I tried to process that, tried to figure out where that left me now. Standing here in a place that felt too controlled to be real, with a man who seemed to understand parts of me I had never explained. And you think that option is you? I said quietly, and this time there was a pause, not long, but noticeable, like he was choosing his words more carefully than before. I know I can give you something no one else can right now, he said, and the honesty in his voice made my breath catch again, because there was no manipulation in it, no attempt to make it sound better than it was, just a simple truth. I nodded slowly, because I could not deny that, not after everything that had happened, not after the way the night had shifted around me without asking, the way I had been pulled into something I could not step back from. Safety, I said, the word feeling heavier now than it ever had before. He held my gaze, steady, unwavering. Control, he corrected, and that one word changed everything again, because it reframed the entire situation in a way I had not considered. Safety was something temporary, something fragile, but control was something else entirely, something that shaped outcomes instead of reacting to them. I felt my breath slow slightly, my thoughts settling into a new pattern as I considered that, as I realized what he was really offering me, not just protection from what I had heard, not just distance from what had been chasing me before, but something more structured, something that did not leave space for chaos to slip in. And that realization was both comforting and terrifying at the same time, because it meant stepping into something that operated on rules I did not know yet, something that would require me to change in ways I had not prepared for. And what do you get out of it? I asked, because that was the one question I could not ignore, the one piece that still did not fit. He did not answer immediately, and for the first time since I had met him, I saw something shift in his expression, not uncertainty, but something deeper, something that made the moment feel heavier, more intentional. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, but it carried more weight than anything he had said so far. Peace of mind, he said, and the simplicity of it made it more complicated, not less, because it meant this was not just about control, not just about outcomes. It was about something internal, something I could not fully see yet. And as I stood there trying to understand what that meant, trying to place myself within a system that was already moving around me, I realized the truth had shifted again. This was no longer about whether I would stay or leave. It was about what staying would turn me into. The word stayed with me longer than anything else he had said. Not safety, not protection, not even control, but peace of mind. And I did not know why that unsettled me more than everything that came before it, because it meant this was not just about me. It was about something inside him that needed to be resolved, something I had stepped into without understanding, and I stood there trying to make sense of that, trying to figure out how I had become part of something that had already been in motion long before I heard those voices in the restaurant. That is not a normal reason, I said quietly, because it was the only way I could respond without pretending I understood it. He did not argue, did not try to reshape the answer into something easier to accept. No, he agreed. And the simplicity of it made my chest tighten slightly, because it meant he was not interested in making this comfortable for me. He was interested in keeping it true. I looked down for a moment, my fingers brushing lightly against my sleeve where the fabric still hid the marks I had spent so long pretending were not there. And I realized something then, something I had not allowed myself to fully acknowledge until now. This was the first time someone had seen that part of my life and not looked away, not dismissed it, not pretended it was something I could fix on my own. I lifted my gaze back to him, studying his expression, searching for something that explained why that mattered to him. You said someone should have done this sooner, I said slowly. What did you mean? The question hung between us, heavier than the ones before it, because this one reached beyond the surface, beyond the situation, into something more personal, something that felt like it belonged to him as much as it now belonged to me. He did not answer right away, and for the first time since I had met him, the silence felt different, not controlled, not intentional, but thoughtful, like he was choosing whether or not to let me see something he usually kept hidden. It means I recognize patterns, he said finally, his voice lower now, more deliberate, and I do not ignore them when I see them clearly. I frowned slightly, trying to connect that to me, to what had happened tonight, to the way he had stepped in without hesitation. And I am a pattern, I said, the realization forming as I spoke. He held my gaze, steady, unflinching. You are a situation that repeats itself more often than it should, he replied, and the weight of those words settled into me slowly, because it meant this was not just about me, not just about one moment or one decision. It was about something bigger, something he had seen before, something he had decided he would not let continue. This time, I felt my breath catch slightly, my chest tightening with a mix of emotions I could not fully separate, because part of me wanted to reject that, wanted to believe I was not just another example of something predictable, but another part of me knew he was right, knew that the life I had been living had followed a pattern I had not known how to break. And you think you can change that? I asked, my voice softer now, less defensive, more curious. He did not hesitate. I know I can. Interrupted, he said, and the precision of that answer made something shift inside me again, because he was not promising to fix everything, not claiming to erase what had already happened. He was simply stating that he could stop it from continuing, and that felt more real than anything else he could have said. I looked away again, my thoughts moving slower now, more deliberate, trying to settle into this new understanding, trying to place myself within it without losing the parts of me that still felt like mine. You make it sound simple, I murmured, and he shook his head slightly. It is not simple, he said. It is decided. And that difference lingered in the air between us, because simple implied ease. But decided implied intention, effort, something chosen and followed through without hesitation. I let out a slow breath, my shoulders easing just slightly as I absorbed that, as I realized that whatever this was, it was not accidental, it was not impulsive, it was something he had chosen fully, and that made it harder to dismiss, harder to walk away from without considering what it could become. And what about me? I asked, lifting my eyes back to his. What do I have to decide? Because that was the part one could not ignore, the part that still belonged to me no matter how much of this he controlled. His gaze softened, just slightly, not in a way that changed who he was, but in a way that acknowledged the weight of the question. You decide whether you stay the same, he said, or whether you let this change you. And the words settled into me with a quiet intensity that made my breath slow, because they shifted everything again. This was no longer about him. Not really, it was about me, about what I chose to do with the opportunity he had created, about whether I stepped back into the life I had known or allowed myself to move forward into something different, something unknown. I stood there for a long moment, the silence stretching between us again, but this time it felt less like something waiting to be filled and more like something giving me space to think, to choose, to understand what was being offered without being pushed into it. And as I looked at him, at the certainty in his posture, the calm in his expression, the absence of doubt in the way he held himself, I realized the truth had shifted once more. This was not about being taken somewhere safe or being kept under protection. It was about standing at a point where my life could split in two different directions, and for the first time in a long time, the choice did not feel like survival. It felt like transformation. The word transformation did not leave me after he said it. It stayed there, lingering in the quiet space between us like something waiting to be accepted or rejected, and I stood there feeling the weight of it settle into places I had kept guarded for so long that I had almost forgotten. They existed, because change was not something I had ever chosen. It was something that happened to me, something I reacted to, something I survived. But this felt different. This felt like stepping towards something instead of away from it, and that alone made my chest tighten in a way I could not ignore. You make it sound like I have control over that, I said slowly, because the idea of choosing change felt unfamiliar, almost impossible. He watched me carefully, not interrupting, not correcting, just letting me reach the end of that thought on my own. You do, he said, and there was no hesitation in his voice, no doubt, just that same quiet certainty that had followed him since the moment I met him. I shook my head slightly, my fingers brushing against my sleeve again without thinking, grounding myself in something I understood. People do not just change because they decide to, I said, because that had never been my experience. Change came with consequences, with loss, with uncertainty that made it hard to hold on to anything stable. He took a step closer, just enough to shift the space again, to make his presence more immediate without overwhelming me. No, he agreed. They change when the environment around them no longer allows them to stay the same. And the words settled into me slowly, because they reframed everything in a way I had not considered. It was not about forcing change. It was about creating conditions where staying the same was no longer possible. And suddenly, standing here in a place that felt nothing like the life I had known, I understood what he meant. I looked around briefly, taking in the quiet, the control, the absence of chaos that had defined so much of my past, and I realized this environment was already doing something to me, already shifting the way I thought, the way I reacted, the way I felt. So this is intentional, I said, turning my gaze back to him, because it had to be. Nothing about this felt accidental anymore. He nodded once, simple, direct. Everything here is intentional, he replied, and the confirmation sent a small, steady wave through me. Not fear, not resistance, just awareness, like I was finally seeing the structure behind everything that had happened, including me. I added quietly, because I needed to hear him say it, needed to understand where I stood in all of this. His gaze did not waver. Especially you, he said, and the words landed heavier than I expected, because they carried a level of focus, of attention, that I was not used to receiving. Not like this. Not without conditions I had to meet or expectations I had to manage. I held his gaze for a moment, trying to process that, trying to find something in his expression that explained why, but there was nothing there except that same calm certainty, that same unwavering presence that made everything feel more real, not less. You are asking me to trust something I do not understand, I said, my voice steady but quieter now, because this was the truth I could not avoid. He did not move, did not try to close the distance further, just stood there, giving me space to hold on to that statement without taking it away from me. I am not asking, he said, and for a second the words felt sharp, but not in a way that pushed me back, in a way that clarified something I had been trying to soften. I am giving you time to see it for yourself, he added, and that changed everything again, because it meant this was not something I had to accept immediately, not something I had to decide in this exact moment. It was something that would unfold whether I rushed it or not, and that realization eased something inside me that I had not even noticed was tense. I let out a slow breath, my shoulders relaxing just slightly as I absorbed that. As I realized I was not being pushed, I was being placed, given space within something already structured, already moving. And if I do not see it, I asked softly, because that possibility still existed, still mattered. His answer came without hesitation. Then you leave, he said, and the simplicity of it made it feel real in a way nothing else had so far, because it gave me something solid, something that still belonged to me. I nodded slowly, my thoughts settling into a new pattern again. Less scattered now, more focused, like I was beginning to understand the shape of this situation instead of just reacting to it. You are very sure I will not, I said, and this time there was no frustration in my voice, just quiet acknowledgement. He held my gaze, steady, unchanging. I am sure you will recognize the difference, he replied, and that answer felt different from the others, less absolute, more observational, like he was not predicting my choice, he was predicting my awareness of it, and that distinction made something shift inside me again, because it meant the decision was still mine, even if the outcome felt inevitable. I looked away briefly, my fingers uncurling at my sides as I let that settle, as I allowed myself to consider what that difference might actually feel like, what it would mean to step into something new instead of circling back to what I already knew. And when I looked back at him, something had changed, not in him, but in me, something quieter, something more grounded, something that felt like the beginning of a decision even if I had not said it out loud yet. Then I guess I should stay long enough to see it, I said, my voice steady, not hesitant, not uncertain, just clear. And for the first time since this night began, there was a shift in his expression that I could not fully define, not quite approval, not quite satisfaction, but something close enough to both that it made my breath catch slightly, not out of fear, but out of recognition, because I understood then that this moment mattered, not just to me, but to him as well. And as the silence settled around us once more, I realized the truth had shifted again. I was no longer standing at the edge of a choice. I had already stepped into it. The moment I said it out loud, something inside me settled in a way I had not expected, not completely, not permanently, but enough to feel the shift, like a door had closed quietly behind me without the sound of a lock. And I stood there holding on to that feeling, trying to understand what exactly I had just agreed to, because staying did not feel like surrender. It felt like stepping into something that had been waiting, something that had space for me in a way my old life never had. And that realization made my chest tighten in a way that was not entirely fear. "Then we start with something simple," he said, his voice breaking through the silence with the same calm certainty that had followed him from the beginning. And I looked at him, expecting something complicated, something that matched the weight of everything we had just said. But he simply gestured toward the room behind me. "You rest properly," he added, and for a second I almost smiled, because the simplicity of it felt out of place in a night that had been anything but simple. "That is your definition of starting," I said quietly, and there was a faint shift in his expression. Again, something subtle but present. "It is the foundation of everything else," he replied, and the way he said it made it sound less like a suggestion and more like a principle he followed without exception. I nodded slowly, because I could not argue with that. Not when my body still felt like it was catching up to everything that had happened. Not when exhaustion lingered beneath the surface of every thought, every movement. "And after that?" I asked, because I needed to know what came next. What this new direction actually looked like beyond this moment. He did not answer immediately, and for a second I thought he might avoid it again. But then he stepped closer, not enough to overwhelm me, just enough to make his presence feel more grounded, more real. "After that, you learn," he said, and the word landed differently than I expected, because it was not what I had been preparing myself to hear. I frowned slightly, my head tilting as I tried to understand what he meant. "Learn what?" I asked, and this time there was no pause, no hesitation. "How to live without anticipating the worst outcome in every situation," he said, and the precision of that answer made my breath catch, because it was not vague, not general. It was specific in a way that felt like he had been observing me more closely than I realized. I looked away for a second, my fingers brushing lightly against my sleeve again. That familiar grounding motion, but this time it felt different, less defensive, more aware. "That is not something you just learn overnight," I said quietly, because I knew how deeply that habit ran, how much of my life had been shaped around expecting things to go wrong, preparing for it, surviving it. He nodded once, not disagreeing. "No," he said, "but it starts with removing the reason you expect it," and the logic in that made something shift again, because it was simple in a way that made sense. Remove the cause, change the response. But the simplicity of it did not make it easy, not for me, not for someone who had built an entire way of thinking around anticipating chaos. "And you think this place does that?" I said, glancing around briefly, taking in the quiet, the control, the absence of anything unpredictable. He followed my gaze, then looked back at me. "This place is only part of it," he replied, and there was something in his tone that suggested there was more, something beyond these walls that I had not seen yet. "Then what is the rest?" I asked, because I needed to understand the full picture, needed to know what I was stepping into beyond just this controlled environment. His gaze held mine, steady, unyielding. "The rest is you deciding to stop accepting less than what you deserve," he said, and the words hit harder than anything else he had said so far, because they shifted the focus back onto me in a way that felt personal, unavoidable. I felt my breath catch, my chest tightening as I processed that, because it was not about him giving me something. It was about me recognizing something I had never fully allowed myself to claim. I shook my head slightly, not in denial, but in disbelief. "That is not something I have ever had the option to decide," I said, my voice softer now, more honest than I had intended. He did not move, did not interrupt, just listened. And when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but carried the same certainty as before. "It is now," he said, and the weight of that statement settled into me slowly, because it changed the narrative I had been holding on to for so long. The idea that I was limited by circumstances, by what was available to me, by what I had been given or denied. And suddenly that framework felt incomplete, like there was something missing from it, something I had not considered before. I looked at him again, really looked, at the steadiness in his posture, the clarity in his expression, the absence of doubt in the way he spoke, and I realized something that shifted everything once more. He was not trying to change me into something else. He was trying to show me a version of myself I had never allowed to exist. And what if I do not recognize that version? I asked quietly, because that felt like the last barrier, the last uncertainty I could not ignore. His answer came without hesitation, without softness, but not without intention. Then I will remind you until you do, he said. And the certainty in his voice should have felt overwhelming, should have pushed me back, but instead it did something else entirely. It made something inside me steady in a way it had not before, because for the first time, this did not feel like pressure. It felt like support, not something forcing me forward, but something standing behind me, making sure I did not fall back. And as I stood there in that quiet space, with the city far outside, and this new world unfolding around me in ways I was only beginning to understand, I realized the truth had shifted again. This was no longer about surviving what had happened to me. It was about learning how to live beyond it. The words stayed with me long after he said them. Not loud, not overwhelming, but steady, like something that had found a place to settle inside me and refused to leave. And I stood there in the quiet of that controlled world, feeling the difference he had been talking about begin to take shape in a way I could not ignore anymore. It was not dramatic, not immediate, just a shift, subtle but undeniable. Like the first moment you realize you are no longer the same person you were yesterday. I looked at my hands again, the same hands that had trembled hours ago under the weight of a tray and a life I could not control. And they were still now, not because everything was fixed, not because everything made sense, but because for the first time, I was not bracing for something to go wrong. I was simply here. You are quiet, he said, his voice pulling me back into the moment, and I looked up at him, meeting his gaze without hesitation this time. I am thinking, I replied, and there was something different in my tone, something steadier, something that felt like it belonged to me in a way my voice had not earlier. He nodded once, not asking what I was thinking, not pressing, just allowing the space for it to exist, and I realized that was part of it too. The difference, not being forced to explain, not being rushed to decide, just being allowed to arrive at something on my own. I took a slow breath, the air filling my lungs without resistance, without that familiar tightness that had followed me for so long. And I understood then that this was what he meant, not safety in the sense of being protected from everything, but safety in the sense of having room to exist without constantly anticipating the worst. I let that thought settle before I spoke again, because what I was about to say mattered, not to him, but to me. I do not know what this turns into, I said, my voice calm but honest, because I was not going to pretend certainty I did not feel. He held my gaze, steady, unwavering. You do not need to, he replied, and the simplicity of it made my chest ease slightly, because it took away the pressure of knowing, of having to define something that was still unfolding. I nodded slowly, accepting that in a way I would not have before, and for a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching between us again, but this time it felt different, not heavy, not uncertain, just complete, like nothing needed to be added to it. I glanced toward the window at the end of the hallway, the faint glow of the city still visible beyond the glass, distant but real, and I realized something then, something that shifted everything one last time. That world was still there, still waiting, still unchanged, but I was not standing in it anymore. I had stepped out of it, not because I was forced to, not because I had nowhere else to go, but because I had chosen to see what existed beyond it. And that choice mattered more than anything else that had happened tonight. I turned back to him, my gaze steady, my posture more grounded than it had been before, and for the first time, I did not feel like I was reacting to him. I felt like I was standing beside him, not equal in power, not equal in control, but equal in presence, and that realization settled into me with a quiet strength I had not known I was capable of. Then I will learn, I said, and the words were simple, but they carried more weight than anything I had said so far, because they were not about survival, not about adapting to what was happening around me. They were about stepping forward into something I had chosen. He watched me for a moment, his expression unchanged but his attention fully there, fully present, and then he nodded, once, a small gesture that felt more significant than it should have, because it was not approval, not ownership, just acknowledgement, like he had been waiting for that moment without needing to push me toward it. Good, he said quietly, And there was something in his tone that made the word feel less like an evaluation and more like a beginning. I let out a slow breath, my shoulders relaxing fully for the first time since the night began. And I realized that the tension I had been carrying was no longer mine in the same way. It had not disappeared, but it had shifted, become something I could face instead of something I had to avoid. I glanced down the hallway, then back at him. A faint, almost unnoticeable shift in my expression as something close to a smile touched the edges of my thoughts. Not because everything was resolved, not because